You know what movie has much better I was trying to fucking work my way back around to the dialogue. You know what movie has my favorite dialogue in anything ever? These Are the Damned from 1962. Yeah, segue, baby. So after we watched that, and I was feeling pretty lukewarm on Pulp Fiction, I was like, you know what? I want to show you a movie for once in my goddamn life. I'm going to show you a movie, Katrina, my beloved. And I wanted to show her one of my favorite movies of all time, which is, I feel like is pretty big coming from me, who does not really care that much about film. Oh, I could rattle on all day about my favorite games of all time, or music, or books, or whatever, but movies, I don't know. I don't find myself that invested in the medium of film, but I will say These Are the Damned is one of my favorite movies ever. It's from 1962. It's, how do I describe it? It's a movie that's really difficult to describe, and I really would recommend that you go watch it. It's one of those where I don't know. It's either... it's walking a very thin line when trying to recommend it, because it's partially one of those movies where the less you know about it, the better, but also one where it could be a little difficult to sell unless I give you a bit of a hint as to what the intriguing part of it is. So all I'll say initially, we'll go through a couple stages. We'll go through the basic beginning premise, like what it starts out as, and then I'll go into a little bit more of like where it has a bit of a turn, and I'll just talk about the whole rest of the movie. So These Are the Damned is this black and white film from 1962. It's by what's his first name? Something Losey. Not like stop typing. Joseph Losey. Who was a director of a couple. I believe he was I don't know. I haven't looked. Oh, he's from Wisconsin? Hell yeah. I haven't looked too much into his history, but apparently at some point he was exiled from America or blacklisted in Hollywood and went to Britain to make some movies. And I think the first of them was this one. So These Are the Damned takes place in this little British coastal town, and it starts out with this woman, this young lady. Oh man, how do I even describe this movie in a good way? In the positive aspects. Like, how in depth do I go before I just start nerding out over every scene? It's essentially I'd say the overall thing is that there's an American tourist who is visiting this little town. He ends up getting involved with this woman who's played by Shirley Ann Field. Let's see. McDonald Carey plays the main character, a man named Simon. He ends up getting involved with this young woman who's like half his age, named Joan, played by Shirley Ann Field, and she is the sister to a motorcycle gang leader named King, played by Oliver Reed, who's awesome in this movie. And he is very possessive to an almost incestuous extent to her. There is a suggestion of that later in the film. And the first 40 minutes of the movie are kind of this back and forth sort of West Side Story tale of the dynamic between these three characters. They also introduce this sculptor who lives up on one of the cliffs on this house. It's like a home that she rents for the summer. Who is her name is Freya. She's played by Vivica Linfors, and she is suggested to have some kind of a relationship with a government sort of military. I'm not sure exactly what his role is, but he's like a organizer, director for the military in the area, whose name is Bernard. which is weird because that's my dad's name. So those are kind of the key characters. And about 40 minutes into the movie, it changes. It changes. Into something vastly different. And if that sounds interesting to you, I'll also say this movie has some of my favorite dialogue in any movie ever. In anything ever. The characters speak. I love the way that they converse with each other. They talk they slip a lot of aphorisms into their speech. There's so many good quotes. There's so many good lines from this movie. Like, let me just go to like the IMDb quotes bit up from it. Excuse me. Yeah, so Freya is asking Bernard about the things that the things that they get up to over at the, the sort of facility they have by the cliffs. And he says like, well, I'm a public servant, but he says I have my secrets. And Freya says, a public servant is the only servant who has secrets from his master. Oh, that's so fucking good. Just so many, I love all the dialogue in this movie. The characters don't speak in any kind of realistic way, but everything they say reveals so much about the way that they see the world, and just like, I don't know, so many just little things in it that I absolutely adore. So the cinematography, I'll say, is I love it. A lot of I love the shots and the atmosphere of this town. It's like a very rinky-dink little town. It's very quiet. Nothing really happens there. Small. It's a small town, and I think that has importance later to the character. I don't know, man. I'm really trying to describe this movie without getting into. Okay, if that interests you at all, maybe go check it out. It's like a little over an hour. You can go see it in full on YouTube in like HD, for free, just uploaded by someone, because I'm pretty sure it's like public domain by now. Go watch it. It's beautiful film print, beautiful quality. Go check it out, and then you can come back to this podcast, I guess. So if you need a little bit more, it's essentially this West Side Story forbidden love kind of the plot that falls off of a cliff, literally, into a bleak science fiction mystery suspense story. The movie takes a wild turn where this plot, this plot line with Simon and Joan results in this scene where the king is after them. Him and the gang are after them. He's trying to. They're probably gonna, I don't know, maybe not kill, but like beat the shit out of Simon, and I don't know. There's gonna be some punishment for Joan. She's already mentioned how, like, the last time she tried to date a man in secret from him, he like locked her in a fucking cupboard for like a week. Like, insane. Like, he's an insane person. So this culminates in the three of them falling down a cliff and being rescued by these children who are at the bottom of the cliff. And the children bring them into this cave. And you find out that there's this strange experiment going on within, like, underground inside of the cliff. They refer to, like, these teachers that they have, and you see these shots where they have this big classroom that also has these kind of like resting areas and beds and stuff like that, and Bernard kind of like gives them they get lessons from these researchers, these military researchers. And you're like, what the fuck is going on? Like, I looked over at Kat and I could see her expression like, what? So eventually, I'll just go into full spoilers now. Eventually, you discover that, so they find out that like, oh, these kids are like, they're freezing cold. They don't produce any like body heat. And eventually the twist, the reveal of the film comes after they try to escape, because they're like, oh, these kids are being held captive, and all the three of them try to escape with the children, which results in them being pursued by the government researchers, who are wearing these like, they're dressed like top to bottom in this like these black suits. The children call them the Black Death. And you find out that the children are radioactive. So they try to escape. The whole third act of this movie is awesome. It's so good. It's so good. They try to escape with the kids. It's this chaotic scene, like the helicopters come out. The kids are like running around. They're trying to find like a car or something to hop into. A bunch of them just get grabbed and taken away. Into complete disaster. And Freya, the artist, comes out, and she's shocked at what's happening down below. And Bernard reveals to her that these kids were born after their mothers were exposed to an unknown type of radiation. And not only are they radioactive, they are immune from radioactivity. They cannot die to radiation poisoning. But they like exude it, which means that all three of our main characters are dying of radiation poisoning. And King especially, who took a really bad part of the fall, is like in really rough shape. And they're talking, and dude, the conversation, this argument they have like on this bench, like it like gives me chills. It sounds really cheesy, but it gave me chills rewatching it. Because essentially these children are being used as, Bernard anticipates, he's basically taken it as a given. And mind you, this was 1962. He's basically taken it as a given that the world is human society is going to succumb to a nuclear holocaust. We're going to destroy each other with nuclear weapons. And these children are, as he sees it, the only hope to rebuild a new Earth. It's the only hope to survive that. And Freya finds that idea repulsive, and she chastises it. She's like, well, what kind of an Earth will they inherit? Some like charred, completely desolate world. And he really doesn't have anything to say besides, his interests are in the survival of the human race, and that's why this is necessary. And the tragedy is that now the children will know that they are prisoners, whereas before they were told that they were on a spaceship going to Earth. And now they'll know that that's a lie, and they've been prisoners in this research facility. And then everyone fucking die. Every fucking character gets killed. They get shot or kill themselves or whatever, right? Man, I just want to gush about, I want to make like a video on like the side channel about this movie. Like I want to go full like YouTuber guy and write like a video essay on a film, because I find every character in this movie so fascinating. So to begin with, Simon and Joan, the two like kind of main characters. So when you're first introduced to the both of them, you don't really expect Simon to be the main character. They're playing this song, this very catchy song, black leather, crack, 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 a black leather, smash, smash, smash. It's this like little cute sort of 50s, 60s style pop song, which I believe was written for the movie. And Joan is kind of like walking around town, and she sort of gives this older man this sort of like, she gives him a little look, and they sort of link link up, and he's sort of like, oh, I'm looking to score with this hot young dame. And then he rounds a corner and gets mugged by the motorcycle gang. He gets mugged by King and his gang. That's when he gets taken to... These two guys find him. They take him to a nearby diner where Freya and Bernard are meeting, and that's when they meet. There's some great lines. Simon says, like, what does he say? He says, like, excuse my appearance, I've been sightseeing. And he asks for a tissue to wash his face, because he says, like, oh, it's much easier to be polite when you're clean. So Joan is clearly a little bit conflicted about, her life and all that. She ends up meeting Simon again, and she finds him on his boat, and he tells her... They basically explain some of, their lives to each other. And she's, I guess, sort of... She doesn't really apologize, but she's there just to, like, talk to him. And she tells him that she and her brother are their parents died when they were very young, and they've basically grown up on their own. And he's horribly possessive of her, and she tells him about these horrible things he's done to her when she tries to date people and warn her away from dirty men, as he calls them, as they both call them. And that's kind of like Simon is kind of a creep. He's kind of a creep, and I like that. I like how a lot of the characters in this movie are really fucked up in some kind of way. Either maliciously or not, or just kind of being victims and, like, badly damaged. So Simon basically tells her that he was an insurance executive, but he quit. He left it behind to, I don't know if he's either retired or he's got something like a lot more casual business-wise going on, but essentially he's got at least enough time on his hands, time and money, to go vacationing on the British coast side. And she says, oh, that must be nice. And he doesn't get it. He's like, what do you mean that must be nice? And she says, well, it must be nice to just have the freedom to leave it all, to leave your life behind. Because that's not something she can do. They have a conversation later where she says, I can't go to any other, I only speak English. She has a very basic education. She doesn't have any connections. They're kind of trapped. They're kind of trapped in this town. Especially her. So Simon, they start this really bizarre romance, which is definitely unhealthy and not good. And I think it's intended to be that way. Because my reading of it is that... So they go sailing, right? Well, actually, the gang shows up. They get Joan off of the boat. They threaten him with knives, and he decides to go sail. He decides, okay, I guess I'll, anchors up, and then I'll do a little sailing. And then Joan, something comes over her. She starts running after the boat. And the other gang members are following her. And Simon says something. He's trying to goad her on into rebelling against her brother. And he's like, jump, Joan, jump. And she takes this leap and lands on the boat. And this other gangster jumps, but he misses his footing. And he falls down, which I think is, like, symbolic. And King is just fucking fuming. He is unwell. He has this sort of, a bit of a veneer of, like, calmness to him in the earlier scenes, but now he's unhinged. He does not have any power over his emotions. And he says, like, oh, when you come back to shore, simple Simon, you're a dead man. It's great. He's so good in this movie. So they're talking on this boat, and they're out at the sea, in the waters. And Simon kind of comes onto her forcefully, and she sort of pushes him away. And she's, you are a dirty man. And there's this interesting push and pull that happens, because the way that I read it is that I don't think Joan is actually very attracted to Simon. I don't think she actually likes him. He kind of represents this sort of, like, forbidden fruit for her in a couple ways, and that's freedom. number one is just the freedom to have a relationship with a man, which she's been barred from. But also the fact that he is this person who has this freedom to just kind of do what he wants in his life, you know? That's kind of like intoxicating to her. And I think she becomes infatuated more with the idea of Simon and what he represents rather than the actual person. And there's like a clear, I don't know, there's a very clear feeling power imbalance between the two of them that I think is accentuated by the fact that he's so much older than her. And it's weird because there's points where he does seem to show genuine kindness for her and worry about like her health and stuff like that. Namely, like after they fall off the cliff and all that. But you're like, how much of that is just him, you know, wanting this like hot young piece, you know? How much of it is genuine and how much also at the same time, how much of that matters is up to, you know, it's up in the air. So they represent, I find that part of the movie interesting. Every character in this film has a different relationship. So at its core, so I've read some reviews and some thoughts, and usually the people who don't like this movie really dislike the turn that it takes, or the fact that it feels kind of unfocused. And because the genre shifts so wildly after that first half. And I totally understand that, but for me, it works because the movie feels consistent at its core, because its tone and its themes are consistent for me. And at its core, at its heart, I feel like this is a movie about characters struggling with control. Every single character has a different relationship to the idea of control, and the way that they relate to it and then to each other, I think makes it really fascinating. Kat did not like this movie. She thought it was very boring and she couldn't get invested in any of the characters. But for me, I think all of them are really interesting. Because she said that they were very, like, I don't know, surface level archetypes or something like that. Maybe not surface level, but she called them, like, very, like, archetypal characters. But for me, the reasons behind their archetypes are so interesting. So, obviously, I already talked about Simon and Joan, but King, one of my favorite characters in the movie. So Simon and Joan, they represent like these two opposite ends of the spectrum. Someone with no control and someone with a lot of control over their lives. King is interesting because he is the most powerful person in his own life, but he's totally out of control. He freaks out for seemingly no reason. There's a scene when he's going after, it's so Simon and Joan, they go and they hide out at Freya's house, unbeknownst to her while she's out, before she returns on the cliffside. They leave when they hear the car coming in. It turns out to be Freya. They think it's King. Freya comes in. She's curious about what's happened. She's, I left the door unlocked. There was, seems like there were two people here in the bed. And King then enters the house himself and confronts her. And she stays completely cool. She's so cool. She stays completely calm and cool the entire time. And so Freya's thing, she's a sculptor. She makes these sculptures out of petrified wood, and a lot of them evoke a lot of freedom and like liberty imagery. There's like birds, there's people, these human forms that are almost like bursting out of the wood itself. And King doesn't like them. He calls them like these horrible, ugly things. And at some point in their conversation, he gets so upset, just kind of out of the blue, like, for real issues, he grabs her axe that she's got hanging around. And you're really freaked out because you have no idea what he's going to do at this point. But he ends up going for the statue. He goes for the sculpture and just smashing it to pieces, which, like, really upsets her. And she's, like, crying and she's freaking out. And what does he say to her? What does he say to her as he leaves? What is it? I think it's in this quotes page or something. Maybe it's not. But he like says something to her as he just kind of storms off. Like he doesn't even want to deal with what he's just done. Just a completely like irrational, unhinged person, zero control over his emotions, and it's like his possessiveness. It's like he's the most extreme examples of daddy and mommy issues. He has like no male figure in his life, so his ideas of adulthood or maturity is this just kind of brute force, exert your will over other people, which has led him into this gangster life where he's become the leader. And he's got these weird mommy issues where later on in the movie, Joan accuses him of, she says, the reason you've never wanted me to be with a man, you never wanted me to be with a man because you've never had a woman. And he doesn't even know like how to react to that. He just kind of snaps at her. He tells her to like shut up or like stop bothering him or something like that. Like it seems like it strikes a chord that Joan is like this, she is the lone feminine presence in his life, and he's like trying to protect her because his own mother is dead, and he's such a fucking weirdo, almost antisocial, like not asocial, which is like shyness, but antisocial as in like destructive to society. That like whatever woman would be attracted to him probably wouldn't end up too well for her. His name is great. I love that his name is King, because it's very ironic, because ultimately, despite having so much authority over other people that he surrounds himself with, he's really like a slave to himself. He's like the shadow of a king. He is a slave to himself and his own hang-ups. And ultimately, it's probably just going to lead him nowhere in life, which is why I love, so the last thing, so it's really funny. So after they drop down the cliffside, King follows after them, and he's the third one to go. The kids find them, and then one of the kids is like, oh, because they have this underground hideout that they think is secret from the adults, but it's not really. The adults, Bernard has actually kind of a paternal feeling of love for them, which is interesting. And he allows them to keep the hideout because he thinks that it's good. It's okay for them. He says like it's healthy for children to keep some secrets from their parents. That's kind of like his belief. He would rather not be like God in their lives, watching everything. So they have this little, you can't really go anywhere unless you're ready to like do a lot of climbing, but they could at least go and stand out in like the mouth of this cave, and look out at and see the sky and stuff. And this one kid that's where they find them. One of the kids is like, oh, you found them by the water. I've never been out. I've never seen anything. She saw a bird. This person saw something, and I saw a fish. I've never seen anything. So they're like, fine, you can. The girl who's kind of like, what's her name, Victoria, I think. She's kind of like one of the leaders of the kids. She has more of a leadership role amongst them. She lets him go outside just for a minute. He ends up finding King, and then that kid and King, I don't know. It's like he's like trying to help him up. He pulls him just enough so that King's like face is out of the water so he won't drown, and King is like trying to pick himself up, and the kid's like, do you need any help? And King's like, no. Like even with like probably bones broken and like a bunch of like physical trauma he's just suffered, he still can't like swallow his pride. He's still just like a total antisocial asshole. He like stumbles into the cave. He's in pretty bad shape for the rest of the movie, but interestingly, one of the this kid who finds him ends up having like forming this weird kind of relationship, kind of one-sided relationship to him that you only really see a couple times for the rest of the film, but he almost looks at him as sort of like a, I don't know, like a big brother kind of way. They assume at first that the three characters are their parents because they don't know who their parents are. And they only know the researchers as their teachers. That's what they know them as. And I think they've been told, like, they believe that one day their parents will come back to them or something. And they kind of believe that Simon, Joan, and King are that, sort of. But this kid kind of almost takes, like, an older brother perspective to King, which is really funny because King flat out rejects it and does not reciprocate it at all. Like, he is dedicated to himself. He does not have a lot of character development until the very end, when during this whole insane chaotic escape sequence, King gets into his car, which he's parked by the cliffs from, like, when they drop down. He gets into his car. The kid jumps in with him, and he tells him not to follow him. The kid does it anyway, and he's like, fucking fine. They're driving, and the helicopter is chasing them. And eventually he just, in like one of the cars, like one of the military guys are in a car chasing after them. And eventually he just hits the brakes and he tells the kid to get out, and he says something like, "I can't take you anywhere." And it feels like a literal and also a metaphorical line. That at this point, he knows that he's dying to radiation poisoning. But it's also like, he sort of acknowledges, like, he's going nowhere. Even if he wasn't going to die, he has no future. He's almost like, he's accepting the idea that he'll never be able to redeem himself and get out of this town. And so they grab the kid. King ends up driving off. They're probably going to they're either like, he keeps driving. He drives to, like, there's this bridge that connects the town to, it's like crosses over a river, right? To the sort of like slightly more, by the coast countryside part. At that point, they're either going to like take him into quarantine until he dies to radiation poisoning, or they're just going to like kill him. They're just going to shoot him outright. And at this point, King's last act is he drives his car off the bridge into the water, and he kills himself. And I think that's great. I love that that's the last thing he does, because the last thing he ever does in his life is that for the first time, he takes control of his life. He's for all of his plays at authority and power over other people, he's never been in control. And now he decides that if his last act is going to be anything, it's going to be taking the control back and deciding how he's going to go out. And I think that's great. That he is this like if anything, he will at least be able to destroy himself. Meanwhile, Joan and Simon get on his boat, and it's not shown, but Bernard tells Freya that they'll die to radiation poisoning before they even hit the shore, and then we'll probably just blow the boat up. And they're just lying on this boat, and excuse me, staring off into the sky. And just sort of saying, Joan asks, like, where do we go now? And Simon says, like, there's nowhere for us to go. The ending of this movie is extremely bleak. It's very dark. Freya and Bernard have this conversation that I mentioned earlier, where they argue over the means and the methods that he's using. And there was some stuff with she's probably my favorite character in the movie besides King. She has some great lines. Like, there's just a bit where they're trying to investigate below the cliffs, but they don't want Freya to see it. So they send a guy up there to distract her. And just in this little conversation they have, he asks her, like, oh, what's the deal with the sculptures? Like, what do they mean? And it's, I think one of my favorite lines in the movie is she says, if I could explain them, I wouldn't have to make them. I think that's, it's such a good line. It's such a good line. But that's like really key to her character, I think, is that Freya and Bernard represent opposite sides. They're both older, wiser human beings, but they represent totally opposite perspectives. Bernard is extremely pragmatic, and he takes a much more fatalist view to humanity, a much more cynical one. He basically sees it as an inevitability that we're going to kill ourselves in a nuclear war. And whatever he has to do now, he's going to try to make it as painless as possible, but it's all in preparation for that horrible outcome. And Freya is the complete opposite of that. Freya's business, her job, her life, is about taking things that are immaterial and things that she can't express in words and making them real, physical, solid things. In a way, it's taking the abstract and making it real. And I think that's so interesting because she has so many of her sculptures evoke this imagery of being free. And she kind of represents hope. She represents a hopeful outlook. Right as the climax is happening, before it's really reached the outside, she ends up talking to this gangster who's out looking, I think, for King. He's out looking for King. They meet and they start talking, and he basically starts to, it's just this random character who's never had a line before. He's been, in the movie, but he's never talked before. It's a member of King's gang, and he's basically just explaining to her, I don't really see myself doing anything, and how he's kind of just like a lost soul. And as everything is spilling out, she's just saying to him, like, no, I believe that you can make something more out of yourself. And this random person she's never met, this random young man she's never met before, she's trying to convince him that something more can be done with his life. And ultimately, I think that's what Bernard and Freya represent in the movie. These two different outlooks that you can have. Something very pragmatic and something very and cynical, or something very hopeful. And then ultimately, Bernard kills Freya himself. They're flying by on a helicopter low to the cliff. This is after she said that, like, well, we just have to go our separate ways then. And I think that's interesting because it's if they represent these two different outlooks and these two different ways that humanity can go, they decide to split apart at the end. And then she goes back to her sculptures. She decides that she's just going to do her sculptures until the time comes, which is a phrase that's repeated constantly throughout the film. Until the time comes. This extremely ominous thing, which is meant to reference this nuclear Armageddon. And then ultimately, Bernard flies by on the helicopter and shoots her low to the ground. And ultimately, the pragmatist kills the hopeful. And the last shot of the movie is panning over the cliffs, and it's the cries of the children, and they're crying out, help us, please, someone help us. And it's very disturbing. And the camera just turns over the cliffs and to the horizon, over the waters, and there's just shouting. They're shouting for someone to help them, anyone to help them. And ultimately, in my mind, that ending is throwing the theme of the movie to the audience. Because who are they talking to? It's no one. In universe, this is falling on deaf ears. The researchers are just going to ignore them or put up with it. Really, they're speaking to the audience. These are the children who have to inherit the Earth. And if this is a warning against, nuclear warfare, against humanity destroying itself, they're imploring the audience that you can make the decision. You have the control. You can exert the control over the future. I don't know if that's like on an individual level or like a mass society scale, but it's throwing the gauntlet to the viewer. And I think that's perfect. At the very ending of the movie tosses the question at you. And it puts you, it's presented you with all of these different relationships with control, from the very intimate, personal level of these people's lives to the biggest scale you could realistically imagine, which is the fate of the human race. And it's asking you whether or not, like, does the human race even have control over its own destiny? Or are we out of control, like King? Are we like King and we're just like, and in King's own self-destruction, is that like us? Is the only thing we as a collective have the power to do is destroy ourselves? And that's why all these things and all these questions really make this one of my favorite movies. I think it's so fascinating. I think literally everything about this movie fucking rules. Oh, I didn't even mention this great scene where, so I mentioned they have this like catchy little pop song at the beginning. And at the end of the scene where the gang is chasing Joan and Simon, it's at night, on the cliffs with all of this, there's like graves or something, or there's like remnants of old buildings and stuff like that have been blown down, and they're sort of hanging around. It's very spooky. And once someone catches sight of them, they start whistling each other. They start whistling to each other, but they're using different parts of the song. They whistle different parts of the song to signal different things, like direction and stuff like that. And you can like tell, because one of them will do like, I can't whistle. And then the next, and then it'll cut to someone else who sees something, go, so many just cool little scenes like that. God, man, I fucking love this movie. And like no one's seen it, so there's some interesting. So, yeah. This movie has a weird production history. Apparently, it was put together pretty quickly. And it was originally, so it's based off of a book called The Children of Light. And the working title for the movie, it had a couple, I think one of them was like The Cliff. One of them was The Abyss. Which are all make a lot of sense for the cliff, the precipice. I think the precipice, I thought it was the precipice. No, it's the cliff. But I think the precipice is a cool name. Because it's such a what would I say? It's such a central part of the movie. It ended up being called These Are the Damned, or just The Damned, depending on where you look. Because it's a Hammer horror film, which I think also gave Kat a bad impression going in, because it's under the Hammer horror brand. And if you're expecting that, you're probably going to be very disappointed. It's not a very scary movie. It's very bleak. And the first half is like this weird romance thing, and like the romance isn't supposed to be particularly nice either. The studio decided to go with the name These Are the Damned because previously they had put out Village of the Damned and Children of the Damned. Yes, Children of the Damned, which is about creepy, like, psychic children. And it's such a difficult movie to market. Like, how do you, like I struggled so hard at the beginning of this segment trying to explain how to even describe what this movie is genre-wise without, like, spoiling it. Because I knew so little going in. I was very pleasantly surprised and very engaged with what was going on once it started turning into something else. And so they decided to go with These Are the Damned because, there's, like, weird children. Even though they aren't creepy or anything, they aren't really creepy. You kind of more feel bad for them. Go look up the poster for this movie. It's terrible. It completely misrepresents what the movie's about. It's like this creepy girl with a creepy doll and these big white eyes. And then just, like, various scenes from the movie. And what is this? Children of ice and darkness. They are the lurking, unseen evil you dare not face alone. Like, what? They're not evil. That's the other thing. There's no, like, real villain in this movie. I really like the fact that Bernard is not painted as a black and white villain. Things he does are very cold-hearted and cruel, but there's other ways in which he genuinely does seem to care about the children and their well-being and their upbringing and wanting to make sure that they are, like, healthy, like, mentally healthy. It's just that his motivations and the whole situation are super twisted. But you understand why he's doing what he's doing. Yeah. So this, These Are the Damned. It's funny because it was marketed as if it was like a horror movie. But I think, and obviously this title has nothing to do with the movie, right? But I think it kind of works. I think it kind of works because really, this is a movie that partially asks, thinking of, like, These Are the Damned in regards to the children is doesn't work, or it's not, like, complete. This is a movie about people who are damned. This is about damned souls. Joan and King are kind of damned to live in this town, right? They're doomed to their fates. King is completely possessed by his own, like, mental hang-ups and his own issues, and he's kind of trapped Joan in this same sort of prison that they're in. The children are obviously in a prison. It's people who are people who are damned to something, and part of the question of the movie, I think, is ultimately whether or not these people are actually is this idea of damnation real? How much control do you have over your fate and your life? How much control do we have over our direction as a society? And I think it ends up, I don't know, it works for me. This is a story about damned souls. One of my favorites, a movie that really, really resonates with me in a lot of ways. Rewatching it just kind of cemented that for me, and probably cemented it as one of my favorite movies, really. So if that sounds at all interesting to you after I've just explained the entire thing, then maybe you can go watch it, like Pulp Fiction.